Hello and welcome to our second demo in our week two. What we did last time was I showed you kind of the basic idea of starting a project from the very beginning. So basically the steps that we went through was to clone a project that's already done for us or at least a template project that's already done for us in Heroku. The advantage of doing that is all of our configurations have already been set from Heroku, and it allows us to be able to simply push just one command and push onto the Heroku server. So what I want to do today is kind of go a step further from that and talk a little bit about the steps that we're going to need to take in order to develop and go through the development cycle throughout the semester. But before we do that, let's go back a little bit and review what we know so far. When I did a push up to Heroku, now remember that last command that we talked about in our last demo, which was Heroku push, git push Heroku master. And what that does is it pushes everything that I have under Git into the repository as well as onto the server that is reserved for us. So depending on what you call your application, the application that we call that we use was comp 276 demo, I believe. And that is the name of our application, and that gives us a unique URL in which we can go and look at our resources. So what we've been doing so far is just satisfying static resources. If you take a look at this code, the idea is that our static application is sitting in this folder called public. We've programmed it to do this. Now, of course, there are dynamic requests that we can have as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in later demos. But for the next, I think, couple of demos, we're going to focus in on this public folder. Okay, so the idea is that whenever we send a request over to our server, the server is going to look in the public folder to see if it can satisfy it. So last time, in the last demo, we saw that if I was looking for the resource mypage.html, it's going to directly look in the public folder and try to satisfy that HTML file. If it cannot, then it's going to do something else, and it might go to our scripting language, and it's going to try to generate this file dynamically. And we talked about this in the lecture as well. Okay, but for now, let's go a little bit deeper and take a look at what this code is actually doing. This express function that's being called here, and also this listen, is working together to provide us everything that we need in order to run this server. So it's saying that the static folder is public. So anytime you need to look for some static resource, you should look under public first. And then it's going to console the log, and it's going to say listening on, and then a port variable. Okay, so this is really all you have to know about this. I'll talk a lot more about what this means in JavaScript later on. By the way, this is JavaScript that you're seeing here, JavaScript syntax that you're seeing here. Okay, a little bit more JavaScript syntax, and that is that whenever we need some external library, I'm going to require it. So here this says require express. It means that we have an external library or package that we need to import before we can run these commands. Okay, so just as an aside, I want you to see that path is also required, but path is actually a library or package that's pre-installed with JavaScript. So it's, we understand what this is. A package is nothing more than kind of an external library that, at least in our case, somebody has written for us and we can use, as long as we can just download it and we know how to use it. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is how we can run our applications, or how we develop locally. So I mentioned at the end of last demo that typically the way that we develop is we try to get everything working locally, right, before we do the push, because, well, it probably makes sense to us that in the middle of our development, there's probably a lot of bugs. There's probably a lot of things that can go wrong, and we don't want to push every single time into the public, right? So we don't want to always invoke that git push Heroku master all the time, because we don't want a master branch. We don't want something exposed to the public that has a lot of bugs, right? That just makes a lot of sense. So what we typically do is we go through several, commits locally. So I commit several things locally, and then I do a little bit of testing, and I make sure everything is working, and that is when I do the final push. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to set up this application to run locally, at least give it the ability to run locally. So, as I mentioned earlier, Express is a package that that needs to be that needs to exist before we can run the server. So, I have this. Sorry, it's under Node demo, and I believe it's called Comp276 demo. All right, so I'm now in the root of my application. Right, so you can see that this corresponds to this view right here. So what I need to do is give my application the ability to be able to import Express, and this is where npm comes in. So npm stands for Node Package Manager, and when we get to Node, I'm going to talk a lot more about what npm is. In short, it's, as the name suggests, a package manager for Node. So what we need to do here is we need to install the Express package. Okay, so by default, Node doesn't know what Express is. Express is actually an open source package that is written and maintained by somebody that we have access to by calling this command. So we can incorporate all of that code into our server. Now, I want to be clear here. What we're doing is we are installing this on a local basis. So I'm installing this Express package as a dependency, and it is sitting in our local repository. So I want you to see here that there is this file called package.json. And again, when we get to the Node section, I'll refer back to this package.json. But one of the things that you should see about this package.json is that one of the dependencies is Express. Now, there's also another dependency called EJS. I don't believe we'll need that, although when we start the server, if it complains about that, we'll also need to install EJS. These things I'll talk about in a lot more detail later. All right, so right now I'm going to install Express. Oh, sorry, by the way, the point I wanted to make here is that these dependencies, when we did the git push Heroku master, automatically, one of the things that Heroku will do is take a look at these dependencies, and they will automatically install them so that our app is going to run. Okay, so locally, if I want the same result, I'm going to have to install these dependencies individually. So I'm going to do npm install express. It's actually going to look on the repo, the npm repo, and it's going to kind of take all of these packages and it's going to install it locally for me. All right, so so just so that I don't find any errors, I don't think we have to do this, although I'm gonna install EJS as well. So in fact, I don't think I need to. If it complains, I'll install this. But the next thing we need to do is we can run this command called Heroku local. All right, now remember at the end of last demo, we wrote, or we invoked the command Heroku open. And Heroku open means that I'm going to go into the World Wide Web, I'm going to go into the internet, and I'm going to go to that URL that I was given, and I'm going to open up the application there. So essentially what Heroku open is doing is it's taking it's opening up my browser, and it's navigating to the URL that's been given to me for this particular project. Okay, so again, it's opening up the browser, it's going to the URL that I've been given for this particular application. What Heroku Local does is it opens a local version of this application. Okay, so nothing has been pushed, nothing is sitting on our external servers. We are basically running it locally. So we're mimicking the functionalities of a server, but on my own computer. Okay, so this is why we can experiment. We can do a lot of things with our code, and it doesn't matter if our application breaks, it's not going to be reflected on the server. Okay, so when I do Heroku local, it's going to run, sorry, Windows, you need to, has a lot of privacy things that you need to invoke. So right now, in the background, it would have ran everything that it did on the server. When we did the push to the server, it would have ran everything that it did there. Okay, so now it says we're listening on port 5000. Okay, on 5000. And this is basically what we did in our code. In our code, one of the things that we specified was that our port is either found in the environment variable, or we're going to make it 5000. So what this allows it to do is, if it was pushed onto the server, we can run the same code, but we can actually listen for different ports. Now, how do ports work? I'm going to talk about that in a couple weeks. But right now, because we're local, we're actually listening to a port 5000. Now, this port 5000 is reserved for testing purposes, for local use purposes. And so what happens is that I can go over to my, maybe I should have closed up some of these tabs. So I can go to localhost and specify 5000. Now there's a colon there. Okay, so when I type in localhost and 5000, this is going to mimic what's going to be on the server when I eventually push it there. Okay, so when I do this, shoot. Okay, so I did need the EJS, and I didn't. The reason was I forgot that the default page actually needed EJS. All right, so let's terminate the process. It's good that we're running through this. It's good to see our mistakes. So I'm going to go through the same process: npm install and EJS. Okay, so so let me just tell you what I was thinking earlier. In order to see our default page in Heroku, I actually needed to go into these views, which, if you take a look at some of these views, the headers and the navigation are .ejs files. Right now, there's nothing on my server that allows me to be able to read EJS files. So this is primarily why, now earlier, because I was saying, oh, the only thing I needed was the public folder, I didn't install this because I didn't think I needed. Okay, but anyways, let's install this just so that it doesn't complain. Okay, so I've installed it. Everything looks like it ran through properly, and I'm gonna now do Heroku local. And again, if everything starts up properly, you'll see listening on port 5000. If you don't mess around with the index.js file, it should actually run. So at least for our first assignment, don't mess around with our with the index.js file. You won't need to. Okay, so let's try this again. And now we see our initial page. So this is the getting started on Heroku with Node.js. So if you ran through the tutorial, you would have seen that you would have seen a very similar page sitting on the root of your application when you pushed it to Heroku. Okay, but this is not what I want to see. I want to make sure that my page.html is viewable from the server, and my page.html was actually hello world. I'm going to add a BR in there, just line break in there, just just because I want it on different spaces or different lines. So I'm going to go to my page.html. And there we go. We have the hello world and comp 276. Okay, so now this you should know that as long as we add to this file, right, we haven't pushed it to our server. So after the demo that I go through today, after I'm happy with everything, then I'm going to make a final push over to my server, and that's when I actually see it in public, in kind of the in the public URL. Okay. All right. So once again, let me just go through what I've just done. Invoking Heroku local means I'm going to create a server on the local environment, on my local development environment. This is going to mimic what it's going to look like eventually on the server. And in order to go to the URL, in order to make requests to this local server, I need to go to localhost and then colon 5,000. Okay, so so this is the URL, or you can think of this as our host, and then 5,000 is our port. Okay, and the colon is just talking about a specific port. Okay, so for the remainder of today, what I want to talk a little bit about is the HTML and CSS language. Okay, so I know a lot of you have some experience with HTML and CSS, so I want to just give a little bit of uh, uh, explanation as to what HTML and CSS are used for, but also I really want to get through this as quickly as possible, just because I think most of you have seen something of this type before. Okay, so as I explained last time, HTML is really a language that allows us to be able to specify a structure. Okay, so specifically what HTML is used for is defining exactly what is on the screen, right? What is on my browser screen. Okay, so so last time I said there's a head, there's a body. Go into a little bit more detail about what these things are. Just as an aside, HTML as a language, it's called hypertext markup language. The term markup language means that I have a language that provides structure. Okay, that gives instructions as to how to put a document together. HTML itself has gone through many versions. You can take a look at the history. I'm going to post some notes on that as well. So there are different versions. Right now, currently, we are in HTML version 5, which its main purpose is to kind of promote some interaction between the user as well as the browser. Okay, so I know there are languages specifically for that, but right now HTML5 is really just a new way of thinking. It's a language that's geared towards interaction and with the user. Okay, so it is maintained by this group called the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. And this is I'm actually referring back to the slides that I posted. So it is they're basically a consortium, a group that makes recommendations. Okay, they're not standards; they're recommendations given to how to write HTML code. So what web browsers do, like Chrome and Firefox and all of these other implementations, they take these standards, or de facto standards, these recommendations, and they build their technology on top of those. Okay, so the understanding is that they give recommendations, but these recommendations are just as good as standards, because they're if not for these standards, then really nobody really knows what to do with them. Okay, so so that's a little bit of history, or a little bit of background on HTML. So let's talk a little bit about the syntax. So the let me delete this for 1 second. The typical tag for a for HTML is something that looks like this. Okay, so we have an opening tag and a closing tag. The closing tag has a slash, and then everything that we open, we eventually have to close, or at least it has to be understood that is closed. So when I make a paragraph and say hello, hello world, and then I have another tag that is kind of built inside this. Oh, by the way, you'll notice that BR right, has an opening tag. So BR means line break. It has an opening tag, but it doesn't have an ending tag that looks like this. Now, if I had put this is actually valid HTML, okay? But there are certain tags that are understood, and there are certain tags that don't need to be closed by the standard of W3C. Okay, so in the reference that I posted on HTML, you can go through all of those, and there's actually going to be a section. Maybe I'll go through it later on today. There's going to be a section on whether or not that tag necessarily has to be closed. Okay, so so let's say I do a hello world, and in here I do a line break, and then I'm going to do a tag. Now a is an anchor tag. Now the thing about an anchor tag, or some of these tags, is it requires an attribute as well. So this is an example of an attribute. So for example, I want an anchor tag to link to sfu.ca, let's say. Okay, so there's an attribute called hrefs, take a hyperlink reference to to sfu.ca. And this is, and in the body of this tag, we can say link to SFU website. Okay, now the attribute is typically, there are some attributes that are associated with every tag. And when you take a look at the reference, you're going to see all the attributes that's associated with every tag. So we have an attribute equals, and then the value of that attribute. So I hope you understand what this means. The A tag, the anchor tag, allows us to be able to link to another page. So when you click on this, it links to the SFU website. Okay, and there's also the content that's inside. Okay, so that's kind of and by the way, you can have as many attributes as you want. So I can have another, you're going to see later that we have this thing called an ID attribute. An ID attribute is allowing us to be able to name that particular tag. So I can name this tag SFU link. Okay, so this is the identifier for this link. And there's a lot of other attributes that you can add. You can add as many attributes to a tag as you'd like. All right, so so there are empty elements, that empty tags that look something like this. Other examples of empty tags would be something like an image tag. So if I do image, right, you'll see that again you have no ending tag, right? You don't have a slash image, so this can. You can just leave this as is. So image is another type of tag. The source is talking about what the source is. So here I actually have a node.svg file. So I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to connect to that node.svg file. This is an image file. And then the alt, I'm going to call it node. All right. So so alt means alternative text. So if you cannot display the image, what are you going to write in place of that? Okay, so I'm just going to write node as the description of what the image, what this image is. So what this is saying is that for people that can't load up this file, or for people that can't see, or they don't have a screen, they don't have a computer screen, what is the text that is going to describe this image? Okay, all right, so we have an image. Let's see, I'm just going to put a BR tag in here. All right, so what else? So there are, you can take a look at the slides for basically the description of what's happening here. But right now, as you can see, that we have our body, right? And body has a child called main. Right? Now I can actually create other children for body as well. So if I have a nav tag, nav is indicating that I have navigation, right? So this is navigation, and this is the main part of my page. So let's say navigation, I have a couple of links, right? So let's say I have an unordered list, and inside I have a bunch of list items. Okay, so this is, I'll say nav1, and then I have another link called nav2, I have another link called nav3, and so on, right? So let's say I have a bunch of things for my navigation, and then I have a main part as well. So the way that we can look at this in terms of hierarchy is that we have a body, and then the first child is nav, the second child is main, and if we had more, like let's say if we had a footer, right, the third child would be footer, right? So maybe I put a copyright here. All right. So, so this is the basic structure of of this web page. So, so in HTML5, there actually has been added a lot of new tags that give a lot more semantic meaning to our page, and this actually helps when we get into things like CSS, when we get into things like JavaScript. This will allow us to be very flexible in choosing particular nodes. Okay, so just going on from my last point, the body has a child called nav. It also has a child called main. Main has then a child called paragraph, which then has some text, and this is called a text node. So you can imagine that in our tree, our first child is a text node called hello world. We have another br node. We have another a node, and then underneath the a node is some more text. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying here. I didn't, well, I didn't actually write it on the screen, but I hope you're understanding what I mean by this. Okay, so we have a bunch of nodes, and you can imagine this as kind of a big tree as a result of the what we're generating here. Okay, so um, so the general idea, or let's see, the general structure of the HTML document is that we typically have HTML at the very top. After our doc type definition, we have HTML that is kind of the root of our page. We also have head and the body, which are the required children. Okay, so we say head and body here are siblings. Inside the head are things that are like metadata for the site, like just information about the site. This could include things like the the title, any style sheets, any metadata, what type of encoding are we using, JavaScript files, all of those things go in the head because it pertains to the whole page. The body is actually what you're seeing on the web browser, and we're gonna get into other structures later on today. But inside the body, we typically have a lot of different elements. Now, HTML5 is divided into a lot of different elements. So let me just go over. Um, Sorry, let me jump over to the course website here. And what you'll find is that the under the references, under HTML, there's this thing, there's this link to content models. It turns out that every tag that you have in HTML is categorized by something, by what it does. So you have all this type of content that's in HTML. So there's metadata content, flow content, sectioning content, and so on. So let me just give a very quick description of each one. So metadata, I explained earlier, are typically tags that are found in the head. So these things are these types of tags are called are something like base or script or style or title. So these give setup information for the rest of for the rest of the page. You also have flow content. So flow content is elements that are used, particularly in the body tag, that are in the main flow of the web page. So they're basically content that can be displayed. What you'll find is that these categories are not necessarily independent of each other. So there are certain elements that are in several different categories. Okay, so next we have what's called sectioning content, and this basically describes the different sections of your page. Like for example, earlier I showed you um, that there's navigation, there's main, there's footer. There are also other ones like like section and article and stuff like that, that are also called sectioning elements. So they provide sections for your web page. There's heading content. So heading content provides headers. So tags such as H1, H2, H3, those are headers. There are also table headers, are heading content. There's phrasing content, which is like the kind of on the text level, right? So that's the content on the text level. And embedded content are things that we can embed into our page that isn't, so the resource doesn't necessarily have to come from our page. So things like video or audio, Canvas, and so on, right? So anything that can be embedded in our web page, that is, those are the tags associated with embedded content. Interactive content, those are the tags that are typically reserved for interaction purposes. So for example, the anchor tag that I showed you earlier has an interactive component to it. So that is one example of an interactive content. So I'll just let you kind of go through this. As you go through this, it'll actually show you, you know, examples of the content. So for example, if you wanted to learn a little bit more about what article does, right? So you can go in here and it'll basically tell you everything that you need about the article element, and the article tag and what it does. Um, so uh, so you can see article, for example, falls under several categories, right? So it falls under the flow content as well as sectioning content, right? Okay, so So those are the different types of elements that you'll see in HTML. Um, okay, so I've talked a little bit about the anchor as well as the image. So both of these require some resource, and the let's see, sorry, the other yeah, I'm gonna skip over a lot of these, a lot of these things from the notes. All right, so the other tag that I wanted to make note of is this unordered tag, unordered list tag. So unordered list has a UL as a beginning and end tag, as well as a bunch of list items. Okay, so the list items are basically allowing us to be able to list whatever things that we need to list. There are also ordered lists, which is OL, and descriptive lists, which is DL. So ordered lists are numbered, are ordered like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Descriptive lists are typically used for like dictionaries or lookups. Okay, by the way, all of these things that I'm mentioning here are in some way mentioned in the slides that I've posted online. So you can have a look at those for more information if you'd like to take a look a little bit further on HTML. Okay, so next, let's talk a little bit about tables as well as forms. So a table tag is probably going to be one of the more important, one of the more useful tags that we're going to see, especially because as we get into server side, we need some way of balancing kind of the HTML, the view of the HTML, as well as getting the data from the database. So whenever we make a database call, for example, we ideally would have a bunch of attributes as well as a bunch of values to go with those attributes. So what I'm trying to say is that the way that we typically store our data on the database is that, let's see if I can write here. All right, so the way that we can store things on the database is typically we have something like this, and you can imagine that we have a bunch of headers. right? So these are all headers. You can imagine that you have a bunch of categories. So this is attribute 1, attribute 2, attribute 3, and so on. And the way that we take a look at the database is that we have several rows that we can input here. So let's say, for example, that this is a users table, and we have our users table, and the users have an ID, they have a name, they have an age, they have other things, right, associated with who they are, and we're storing this on the database. Now, one of the basic things that we're going to do with our database applications is typically we want to read from these tables and access all of the rows that are associated with users. So for example, if we have 100 users, we could actually take 100 rows of data and we can work with it within our application. Now, the problem with this, if you've taken a course like database, or if you've even seen an application of database before, is that the language that the database speaks is different than any programming language. So what essentially we need to do is we need to program it into a form which can communicate with the database, right? So if I had a bunch of users, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, all the way down to 100, and I take all of this data and I want to be able to represent this, well, the most logical way to represent it is using a table. Okay, so all of this is really just to say that tables are important in HTML. Okay, so how do tables work? Let me delete all this. And so tables in HTML are typically work like this. So there is a tag called table, and table has a beginning and an end tag, so we know that where the table starts and where it ends. It typically has table rows. So table rows is indicated by TR. There's also this, well, let's go through table headers first of all. There's table headers, which is kind of like the header of the table, and there's table rows. So we can have, table rows, and so on. We can have many rows of this table. Okay, so what you're seeing here is kind of the outline that we have table header as well as 2 rows. Now, within these within this table, we can also have table data. So let's say table data, we have, oops, there we go. Table header, I must have. Oh, my mistake. All right, so it is a table row, but within there's table headers. There we go, table header, and we have attribute 1, let's say. And then we have another table header, like attribute 2, and so on. Okay, so we can have as many attributes as we want. And then here, this is called table data. So table data, attribute 1, let's say, has the data 1, 2, 3. And then it has another data that is this time under attribute 2, and we'll just say hello. Okay, and then you have another table data. Let's say our second row reads 3, 4, 5, and then we have another data, and that is world. Okay, so I'll show you what this looks like in a second, but essentially this is our table header, right? So this is header, and these are the rows of our data. So I hope you can kind of see the connection between what I'm displaying here and a typical database that I described earlier. So one of the things that when we get into databases later on, you're going to find that is essentially what we're doing. We're creating a table with many, many rows. And of course, we're going to use for loops for that, right? So we're going to, for every data item that I have in my database, I'm going to loop through this code and I'm going to display everything onto the screen. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to be doing for tables, but I just want to introduce that concept at least in HTML. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about in HTML here is talking about forms. So a form is also something very important that we're going to be doing, especially for server-side programming. Now, the first thing that I'll show you here in this HTML file is that the form tag, when we create one, typically has action and method associated with it. Class is not that important. In fact, I'll get rid of the class altogether for now. But the two attributes that are typically important for us are the action as well as the method. So method is talking about what HTTP method are we using in order to transfer the data that I'm about to write into this form. Okay, so the form is basically in HTML looks like, sorry. Okay, it basically looks like this. We have, some form in HTML that we can fill in, right? So maybe I can tell the user to fill in their name, and I can give them some space to fill in their name. I can do age, and I can get them to fill in their age, and so on, right? And then I could have a button here that is typically called submit, that I can take all of the data that's in this form and send it over to the server. Okay, so this is the idea of why we have a form on the client side, right? So on the client side, we have our HTML. We're basically filling in all of these fields, and it's a way that we can interact with the server, right? So it's a way that we can send information from the client over to the server, and the server can deal with that dynamically. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the method of this transmission later on when we get into server-side programming. But just for now, we should note that there is always a method associated with it. Okay, there's also an action associated with it. So what this action says is, where does it go on the server? Right. So all of this information that I'm filling in, when I click on submit, when I click on this submit button, that's supposed to be a finger, it goes over to the server. And where does it go? What file, what script do I need to run with the data that I've sent it? Okay, so that is the action of the form. All right, so I know I'm leaving you hanging a little bit here, but right now all I wanted to show you is the structure of this form and what types of things we can add to it. Okay, so again, just gonna delete all this here. Sure, there's a faster way to delete. Okay, so so in the form, there are different ways that we can have inputs go into this form. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the inputs. There are actually many that are there. Take a look at the file that the slides that I posted on the course website. But some of the inputs that I can give here are, for example, text. So text just gives you kind of a text box. So type text would give you that. You can name this. Now, it's important to provide a name. So for example, if I do fname, right, this is the name that programmably we're going to use as a variable on the server side. So when we send whatever's in this text box, we're actually sending the variable name as fname here as well. Okay, so the value is what we associate with that box. Right now, there's no value, but the intent is to have the user type in the value. Okay, now there's also an attribute called placeholder where we can give a placeholder for this for this, right? We can say name, right, as a placeholder. And I'm going to show you in a second what all of this looks like when I run this. And okay, so let's take a look at a few more inputs. So there's another type of input called password. Okay, so if you do password, then basically when you type this in, it's going to be commented out. It's going to be replaced with stars. We've all seen passwords before. There's another one called email. There are other ones called number, I believe. And I'll just very quickly tell you what these things are. So email if you require an email, so required is actually another attribute. So if it's required, then automatically when you submit this form, we're going to look to see if what you've entered here is a valid looking email. So does it have an ampersand in there? Does it have a dot and then a .com or something like that? So so that's the purpose of having all these different types. Now, again, look at the slides to see all the different things that we can do with the forms. There are a lot of different controls that we can put with the forms as well. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about that in our next demos. I'll just assume that you've taken a look at some of those and we can work directly with it. There is one last thing that I want to show you very quickly, which is the submit button. Okay, so the type submit, it's going to have a name. So I'm going to write submit as a name, and then the value, I'm going to put submit. Now you're going to see, put a couple of exclamation marks there. So this is what actually shows up in our submit button. So this submit is actually a button that's going to be shown on the form. Okay, so right now I'm going to actually leave the action blank. I'm going to leave the method as post, but again, I'm going to come back to that later on when we do another demo on the server side. All right, so so really that's all I wanted to tell you on the HTML side. So right now, you see that our server is actually still running. So if I go over to my web page and I do a refresh on this, so localhost 5000 and my page.html, you're going to see all of that. I should have probably made this image a little smaller. So there's a link to SFU. There is this node.svg that I've created that's very large. And that's what gets displayed. Now we have this table. Now you kind of have to imagine what this table is. There's no lines that are separating these tables, and this is by default. So you have the attribute 1 and attribute 2 as the table headers, and then you have a bunch of attributes that are, sorry, values for these attributes in the following rows. So that is kind of what's going to be mimicking our table. Okay, so whoops, I made it auto-complete here, but if I didn't make it auto-complete, this would actually show our placeholder, which says name, and then we had another input, which was our password. So if I type in something here, there's there's this password representation here. This is email. All right, so again, if it says please fill in this field, and if we typed in invalid email, it would give us some feedback on that. And then you see number actually gives us a way that we can kind of navigate the numbers. And this is just the different defaults that are given by this browser. Okay, now you see submit is a button, and this is the value of that button. So when I click on this, this is going to send all of this information that I've typed in here, and it's going to send it over to wherever the action is. Okay, so right now I haven't specified the action. In fact, I'm going to come back to this page and make some alterations as we do a few more demos. But right now, I want you to see that I could have made a few more changes here. But at this point, let's say I'm happy with my web page. Okay, so I'm going to hit Control C just to get out of this. Okay, so I'm going to terminate. So Control C, it's also Control C if you're working on a Mac as well. But right now, if we do Heroku Open, okay, now remember what Heroku Open does. It goes to our the URL of our web page, and it opens that up on our browser. All right, so it was called comp276.demo.herokuapp.com, and it's trying to open that up. You see it takes a little bit of time on startup because in Heroku, if your application is not running or nobody is sending requests to your application, it will automatically shut down. So if it's the first time that you're coming back to your application in a while, it requires a little bit of time to do the startup, to kind of wake up the application. So right now, if I go to my page, what's it called? My page.html. You're going to see that it's actually showing what I had before, and that's because I haven't pushed anything onto the server. So this is what I was talking about earlier. This is what I'm seeing locally, right? This is what I'm seeing on my own computer. This is what I'm seeing in the server. Now, let's say that I've tested everything locally. I'm happy with this. I want to push it up to the server. I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I did before. I'm going to do a git add. Now I have to be in the root of my application. So git add, I'm going to do a git commit, and let's say, let's give it a kind of a descriptive a tag to it. Added more HTML. It should probably be a little bit more descriptive than this, but so I've added those, and now I'm going to do a git push Heroku master. Okay, now once again, I just wanted to go through this process. It looks at your Git, whatever the URL is defined right now for Git. Let's see what happened here. Perhaps I didn't log in. Let's see if I can do this again. Okay, so let's see. All right, so let me pause here and just come back to this in 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So let me just go through what the problem was earlier. If you see a problem of when you're trying to push to Heroku, of trying to install the node modules, and you see a problem that's similar to something like this, your package lock.json is not in sync. Then what I just did was I just went through and I deleted that file. So there should be a file that's called package lock.json, and I just deleted that file from locally what I had. So it apparently arises from when I was installing the dependencies earlier. I got the two files out of sync. So I just deleted it from my local version. And so just show you what I did here. So I deleted it and I did an add. I committed that, so I deleted the package. Actually, I spelled this thing wrong. It should be package lock.json. So then I did a new push, and now it should be working. Okay, so so if I go to Heroku Open, all right, so you see this is the application. If I then go to my page.html, this thing should show up. Okay, great. So so the next thing that we want to discuss is what happens if I wanted to make this image smaller, for example. What if I wanted to make this link look a little bit different? What if I want this navigation to be a little bit larger, and so on? Okay, so and what if I wanted to make them show up in a different way? So that's where the style sheets come in. So so in my next demo, I'm going to talk a little bit about style sheets and how we can turn this into something that looks a little bit better.